Hello! You're watching The Great Canadian Bagel here, and today I have another one of my deep dives into how the different sub-regions of Canada moved in the 2025 election. Now, before I begin, I've had a lot of complaints in recent videos that the audio levels were wrong. Their playback was too quiet or whatnot. I've changed my audio settings. I've raised the gain on my microphone, among other things, tweaked the recordings settings in the application I'm using to record. So let me know in the comments below if the audio is better or if it's worse. Because when I play this back on my own desktop, it seems fine to me. So I'm not sure why people have been having issues, but I thought I would give it an attempt to make it better. So let me know if that was worth doing or if the audio is now awful and I should undo what I have changed. But with that, before we begin, I also want to shout out my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel. You make a lot of this possible. I wouldn't be doing this for the most part if I had no support. So it's nice to see that. If you guys want to support the work I do here and you like to see more of it, by all means go and link in the description below and press that membership join button. Or you can do your other YouTube things like share, subscribe, and comment below. But with no further ado, let us begin. So, last week, I made probably too big of a video. I did all of Quebec and then the GTA. That was probably too big. I don't really like making videos that cross much past the 40-minute mark, even though I do that on a regular basis. So I have decided I'm only going to do 2 subgroups today. We're going to do the rest of Ontario. So that's rural Ontario and the smaller cities in Ontario. So places like Ottawa. I am technically including Gatineau in this because it makes no sense to talk about Gatineau in the context of Quebec for the most part. Yes, the bloc runs there, but the dynamics in Gatineau are very similar to the dynamics in the rest of the Ottawa area. And obviously the rural parts of Ontario. So to start with, let us hit up rural Ontario. So, we don't want that. Boop. So, I have broken rural Ontario into a few regions. There's 4. Eastern, Central, Western, North. Self-explanatory. Now, these are the ridings I'm classifying in both. Now, you might notice some of these, like York, Durham, are technically in places, I think New Tecumseh, Gwillimbury are technically in the GTA. Like, legally speaking, they are in York and Durham regions. But I'm not including those in the GTA because these ridings are much, much, much more rural. They're small towns, some ex-urban, but a lot of rural, such as farming and other like resource communities in these areas. So it doesn't really make sense to group them in with the same areas as like Vaughan or Markham, which are more, they're proper little cities. They're suburban satellite cities of Toronto. So grouping those in with the much more rural areas doesn't make any sense, so I split those out. You have these guys for the Western. And then North is pretty self-explanatory. North is the North. So let's compare. So traditionally, Eastern Ontario has been the best region for the Liberals. Even in the dark times, they're still getting 22, 27%, 16-23 in Central comparison, 16-23 in Western. In the North, 19-29. It's not too bad in the dark years. But Eastern is really where their core base is in Ontario for the rural parts. And you see this in the 90s where they're high 40s in the 50s. You see this in 2015 with Trudeau's rally. He pulls into nearly 44% here. You don't see kind of performances like this in 2015, except a little bit in the North. But the North has different dynamics here. And then naturally, we shouldn't be surprised to see a really big increase in Liberal support in 2025. 2025 sees the technically best raw vote results for the Liberals. They got over 100,000 more votes than 2021, and 50,000 and a bit more than Trudeau got in 2015. Now, obviously, vote share wise, they did not beat 1993, but this is still the second best vote share the Liberals have gotten in this region. Now, part of that is because this region contains, because this is roughly speaking what I call Eastern Ontario, it contains places like Kingston. It contains places like Peterborough, which are a more significant small city. Now, and that it's very different in the small cities in the rest of Ontario, in southern Ontario. And then also you have places like, what's the word here? Glengarry, Prescott, Russell, and some of these other places on the Quebec border which have a much larger Francophone-speaking community. And in this part of Ontario, the Francophone community tends to be more liberal. Now, this goes back very long stretches, and I don't think this is necessarily going to be sustained forever, but traditionally speaking, the Francophone minorities in the rest of Ontario and the rest of Canada and the Anglophone minorities in Quebec are some of the most core liberal base. The Francophones in Ontario and New Brunswick, very strong liberals. Anglos in Quebec, very strong liberals. Now, there's obviously some nuance there, but that is one of the big factors involved here. Now, for the Conservatives, this is actually quite a good performance. This is their third best. Now, you could argue that their better performances in 2008 and 2011 really don't count because turnout is just so much lower, being 360 to 390 in the 2006 to 2011 window. That's pretty low compared to what it is nowadays. And it's not that the population of this area has exploded. It's gotten bigger, like the rest of Canada has, but not dramatically so. Especially this change is not driven by population growth, for the most part. So these performances look so good mostly because Liberals didn't vote in these elections. And then you come to 2015 when a lot of Liberal turnout returns and suddenly it's different. And you can see this in the raw votes here. 2006 to 2011, there's a little bit of vote gain, but not a lot. 2015, there's a bit of a regression, but not a lot. But then 2019 and 2021 for the Conservatives, they're actually better than the Harper era. So the main difference is in the dark years, the Liberals just do phenomenally bad. These are the three worst years. And that's going to come true with every region, but it's particularly notable here. But with that all said, there is definitively still a trend in this region, even though it had a slight regression this cycle, that it is getting more right-wing. In a lot of these rural areas, or more rural places, a lot of these smaller cities, in particular places like the Francophone minorities, and like Glengarry, Prescott, Russell, while they did perform really well for the Liberals this election, the historic trend is that they are getting more and more conservative as rural-urban polarization eclipses, say, linguistic polarization or other kind of things. So as rural-urban becomes more important, these areas are being pushed to the right. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Conservatives actually got more votes here. A little tiny bit, but they got more votes here. Even with this really huge Liberal turnout, even with a collapse in the NDP vote. Now, in this particular region, as I said in other regions, I'm not entirely clear if this NDP vote went Liberal, Conservative, or stayed home. It might be a mix of all three. But other regions, it's a little more obvious. Now, moving on to Central Ontario, this has been a region that the Liberals have been struggling with for a while. It's really not been a strong region for them. And for those at home, Central Ontario, in my definition, is like vaguely this area kind of thing. So they've been struggling in this area for a while. Even in 2015, they couldn't pull out a popular vote win, even with, in the 2015, a relatively weak performance of the NDP. Even in this particular cycle, with an almost zero performance of the NDP, they still couldn't pull out a popular vote win. In fact, they couldn't even beat their 90s average. And this region is very clearly drifting to the right. You look at these 4 of the last 6 elections have had a plurality of the vote for right-wing parties. And if you look at the preceding 5, only 1 did. And again, this is the same rural-urban polarization as everywhere else. Yes, in Central, if you look at this, you do have a meaningfully sized city in Barrie. Barrie is a pretty decent sized city. I think it's in the 100 to 200,000 person range. But that still gets grouped in with rural here, mostly because I don't want to make a sub-region of 2 ridings. So you could say that Barrie should be separated, but the movement in Barrie is really the main story of why this region is shifting to the right, because the small cities like this are becoming more conservative, as are rural areas in general. In this particular region, I'm pretty sure the NDP was actually split between the Conservatives and the Liberals, and most of the new turnout went Liberal. Some went Conservative, don't get me wrong, but in this particular region, I think the NDP vote mostly defected Conservative. In West Ontario, it's kind of the same thing with the NDP vote. I think there are more NDPers in the rural West defected Conservative than they defected Liberal. Obviously, there were some who defected Liberal. And I think most, from what I've looked at this and the riding by riding stuff, I suspect most of the new voters were actually Liberals. Now, West overall has pretty much never been a good region for the Liberals. They've done bad in almost every single election since the Conservative Party formed. Only 2004 they did decent, and by that they won the popular vote. They got a decent share of the vote share themselves. But that was with a unusually weak NDP. You compare the middle, 7 elections. That was the weakest NDP performance, and they only barely nudged out the weakest Conservative performance. And you start seeing here, in the last, since 2004, the Conservatives consistently dominated here, and the NDP's pretty much evaporated here at this stage. And you can see in the last 7 elections, that's 6, only 1, the Liberals or the left, won the popular vote region, so this is very clearly drifting to the right. It looks on average to be slightly left-leaning because of the early days, where the NDP was a lot stronger. The Liberals and the NDP combined were a lot stronger. The Liberals were quite good in the Craig Chen era, when the Conservatives were split. And Craig Chen was more of a neoliberal type, so he was not quite as left-wing. This is the Craig Chen era is like the peak of before rural-urban polarization hit Canada, really. Then we get to the north. The north is interesting because when I've looked here, obviously almost all these PPCs went Conservative. But I suspect, contrary to what other regions were, I think most of the new voters went Conservative here. And the NDP actually went Liberal. I can't confirm that for a shadow of the doubt. You really need to do some really detailed exit polling. But if you look at the dynamics of the different ridings, it really does look like, unlike other places, the NDP to Conservative switch was quite small here. I mean, I'll give you an example, some of these aren't really easy to compare because they broke up. We'll go Sudbury. The Liberals at 32 and the NDP are at 5. You go to this one. The NDP's at 14. The Liberals at 16 in 2021. The way the math, I'm not explaining it very well, but the if you look at this on the riding by riding basis, we'll get a better sense of this when Elections Canada finally publishes the poll by poll data. But the very localized trends that I've spotted while looking at this data, it does look like the Liberals gained the most in areas where the NDPs lost the most, if that makes sense, is what I'm trying to get at. So that kind of implies that they cannibalized NDP voters. Whereas if we go like central, the NDP lost votes in places where the Conservatives kind of gained the most. This is a really broad overgeneralization, but you get my point. Now, the North has been a region, as we can see here, for the longest time where the left did really well. Unionization, the Indigenous population, low turnout from people who are otherwise conservative inclined, because working class, blue collar conservative types are the least likely voters to vote. Usually, because a lot of these people are really jaded. They don't really see the difference between the two parties. They don't really see the purpose in voting. So they're the lowest turnout subpopulation in pretty much the entire country. So those are big wrinkles. And then the other big wrinkle was unionization in a lot of these communities. And the NDP spent a lot of effort and they did a lot of goodwill throughout the 2000s building up here. Under Jack Layton-Mulcair era, Jack Layton improved 4 elections in a row in Northern Ontario. Quite impressive. Mulcair did okay, but Singh kind of went nowhere until the very end when he fumbled it between the combination of pressure from the Conservatives swinging more to try to win the unionized voters to the overall rural-urban polarization trends to the more focus on cultural issues where working class people being socially conservative really came into play. And then obviously the trade war with the US. Now the Liberals in turn have had some quite good performance here, especially under Chrétien, but even Paul Martin, Trudeau have had good performances. So this 46 is really not that unexpected, especially with the NDP collapsing. That, roughly speaking, 20 points the NDP lost. A lot of that vote share went to Liberals. If you actually look at the math here, most of these voters likely went Liberal. Obviously, some did go Conservative. Some did stay home. But a lot of them did, the lion's share, to go Liberal. And it does seem very likely, especially if you look at the 10-year trend here, where each election the Conservatives are improving by at least 5 points, closer to 6 at this stage. It's very likely that in 2029, all else being equal, you might see the Conservatives actually win the popular vote by like a relevant amount. Like, technically they won the popular vote in 2021. They technically won the popular vote. Actually, no, that's the only time they won the popular vote. Never mind. I thought they won in 2008, but I was mistaken. They technically won it in 2021, but that's a relevant margin. And they also only won like 2 seats in the North in 2021. They came close to a couple, but close only counts on horseshoes and hand grenades. In this election, they're close in Nipissing, Timiskaming, pronunciation. They're close in Sault Ste. Marie. They're close in Thunder Bay, Rainy River. That's 3 ridings they're close in, and they won 4. I think it is a reasonable likelihood, if nothing changes, you'll see most of Northern Ontario go Conservative. You'll see places like Sudbury probably hold out. You'll see places like Thunder Bay probably hold out because of the peculiarities of those being quote-unquote cities. I say quote-unquote like they're technically legally cities, but saying at Thunder Bay at 100,000 people is a city, and the same token, like, this does not imply the same thing as Montreal is a city. Putting those two in the same camp is really disingenuous. They're very different beasts, but for the purposes of how people vote, that's more than enough in Northern Ontario. Thunder Bay votes very similar to how other cities vote. especially say like Winnipeg. So that's the overall trend in the rural parts of the province. And again, you can see here, there is a distinct gain. If you, like, if I go down here and copy this, you look at the last 2-year average, that's 43% for the last 2 elections. It was 29% for the first 2 in this time period. That's a pretty big improvement. And I think it's likely going to only get more if Canada continues to follow the same trends that happen globally. Now, I will just caveat this, is it does seem like Mark Carney, at the first 2 months of his term, might be trying to pivot to a different direction than a lot of the global liberal types. But we'll see if he actually does that. And we'll also see if that's enough. Because it could very well be the case that the rural / blue-collar working class resource manufacturing workers who make up a lot of the population of Northern Ontario, or their dependents or siblings and stuff, maybe it's already too late for these groups and they're all going to inevitably shift to a more conservative party because of things moving on social issues as opposed to economics, but we'll see. If we go to just the overall trend of rural Ontario, again, I will make this a little bigger so we can see it a bit better. Oh, I don't need that. Okay, we'll do. Should I have organized these better? Yes. There we go. You can see here, 2025 was the best performance ever in rural Ontario for the Conservatives. They got a majority of the vote in and of itself. This is on the back of their third best performance in 2021. And again, a strong performance in 2019. Not the best, but still strong. A top 5 performance. The Liberals did really well here in rural Ontario this time. Their best performance since 2000. And the NDP have had their worst performance ever. At least on all phrases. They have had their worst election in the 11 election data set that I'm using here. And the PPC got nearly wiped out. Same with the Greens. Moving on to the next one, we have Ontario, other, urban. Oh, you can't see that. Anyways, so, oops, I don't want to do that. Okay, we're going to go here. So, as I said, these are the other cities in Ontario / Quebec in the case of Ottawa, because this is Ottawa Gatineau. Oh, not spelling. Gatineau. That are more than 2 ridings. Yes, you could say Essex and London being... Well, London you could probably argue could be 4 if you want to include the rural area. You could say Essex being 3 is pushing it, but whatever. I don't care. So now, in Ottawa, we'll start from the Conservative side because the Liberal side is remarkable. This performance was actually decent for the Conservatives. It's better than the last 3. It's not their best, but it's the 4th best. Like, that's a pretty strong performance on their backs of things. And their turnout did go up. Now, it's likely mostly cannibalization of the PPC and maybe some turnout of other or non-voters. But overall, or new voters, I should say, it wasn't a terrible performance on paper for the Conservatives. What takes this Conservative performance from what looks like it should be good to what turns out to be bad. Because remember, the Conservatives lost Carleton in this election. And again, this is what I'm counting as Ottawa, I'm counting as Hamilton, Niagara, Kitchener. This really should be like Kitchener, Cambridge, Guelph, but whatever, I don't really care. What really turns this into a disaster is not only do the Liberals cannibalize almost all the NDP, Not only do they cannibalize almost all of these greens, if that was it, that would be fine. It's only 77,000 more. They turned out just shy of like 60,000 new voters, as well as cannibalizing 77,000 voters from other left-wing parties. And their turnout dwarfs the new turnout for the Conservatives, in the sense that this is actually the fourth best result the left has ever gotten in Ottawa, in a time when the NDP had their second worst performance on record. The Greens had their third worst on record. Again, in the time period of 11 elections. The Liberals had their best election in 32 years in Ottawa, Gatineau area. I've dropped the block off here because technically there's a column for the block here, but I don't really care. Doesn't matter. So that's quite remarkable. That's quite remarkable. But this does not replicate with the rest of rural Ontario or small city Ontario for the most part. Especially when you do it in the simplified left-right spectrum. We'll go to Hamilton, and this is, I think, the best case study for this. Because, yes, in Hamilton, the Liberals gained 10 points. But the NDP lost 17. The Green lost nearly 2. And the Conservatives gained nearly 14 points. And this puts the simplified left-right from an average-ish showing for the left and right to the best performance the Canadian right has ever posted in Hamilton. They actually won a riding in Hamilton proper, not just the rural area that's attached to Hamilton. They won Stoney Creek, Hamilton East, Stoney Creek, just barely. But hey, a bear win's a win. But they also came really close to Hamilton Mountain. They came relatively close to Hamilton Center. That's honestly something that anyone would have thought a while ago. And this is where you start seeing some interesting things. You look at Hamilton Center here. This is a good case study. I'll zoom this in a bit more so you guys can see it. It occurs to me sometimes I don't zoom these in and it's hard to see. But if we look at Hamilton Center in 2021, we compare it to 2025. The NDP only loses 2,000 votes in Hamilton Center. Only loses 2,000. What we actually see in this riding, and a lot of other ridings are like this, is there's actually 18,000 new voters, and they overwhelmingly went Liberal and Conservative. In 2021, if turnout was the same, except the Conservatives gained 11,000 votes, as they did, they almost beat the NDP here, just on the back of their defector / new turnout. So some of this stuff is quite remarkable. You look at Hamilton East, Stoney Creek. The NDP loses 10,000 votes. So in some of the ridings where the NDP have incumbents, they managed to hold on most of their vote share, but other ridings like Stoney or East Creek or Mountain, they lose tons of votes. 10,000 here, 8,000 here. I believe that's 9,000. Yeah, that's 9,000. And some of these, such as West, a lot of those NDPers probably went Liberal. Some were new Liberal turnouts, obviously. But then you look at some like Mountain, and it's kind of hard to say where that went. It might be pretty split. It's hard to say. But the gist here is the NDP vote evaporates, but it evaporated most, because this is one of the best case studies so far of all the NDP ridings, because they lost. This was a riding they come in and lost. They disproportionately lost votes. Ridings where they did not have an incumbent, they evaporated. Ridings that they had an incumbent, they only lost a small amount of vote share, or a small amount of raw votes. But we're now at the point here where, all else being equal, if the Conservatives kept up this turnout, it's conceivable that they might actually flip most of Hamilton in, say, 2029, because a lot of the Liberal turnout were dippers who voted Liberal for the first time, who might be disappointed because Carney so far is governing to the right of where they thought he was going to be. A lot of NDPers have been complaining about this already. But notably, a lot of these people are quite old, and they're voters who were activated by the foreign policy crisis. And this is true across the entire country, for the record. And it's debatable if they will get turned out again. Now, obviously, this could hold true to the Conservatives. Their turnout could also fall. Or something could happen and turnout could be up for everyone again in 2029. But it is an interesting note that, based on what I can tell in the demographics of people who voted, this seems a much more sustainable number in Hamilton than this is. Now, conversely, this number in Ottawa might not be very sustainable for the Conservatives, and this might be relatively sustainable for the Liberals for kind of the opposite reason. Like, yes, these voters are older than these ones probably, but the fact that Conservatives lost every seat in Ottawa and did so bad might just depress voters next time, and they just might not vote. So it might crash turnout. You might see turnout fall to, say, 60,000. 160,000, I should say. And the Liberal turnout might go down a bit because some of the dippers might go back home. Some of the Greens might go back home. Some of the people might have died. God rest their souls. But I don't think it's going to, in Ottawa specifically, I think the Liberals will hold this up better than the Conservatives will. Another one, Niagara. Again, same sort of gist. Liberals gain a lot of vote share here. The Conservatives gained more. And this goes from being a comfortable but competitive region for the left to razor-thin toss-up region. This is the best vote share performance the right has ever had in Niagara in time period. This is the most raw votes the right has ever had in time period. This is the first time the right has won the popular vote if you mentally add the Liberals and NDP together, which you could argue is not a great metric, but hey, this is the first time. Well, I guess they technically won in 2011. Sorry about that. I forgot this one. But 2011, again, this is really exceptional because turnout is, again, quite low in this election. It's lower than 2006. It's lower than 2015 by a decent margin, about 10,000, 15,000. But I digress. This is a region where it's not super clear where the NDP went. They probably went mostly Liberal. That is the safe bet, but they could have also went, a lot of them went Conservative in these small towns. In these small, more industrial towns. But this is one of the regions I identified back in the day, if you remember back to the Pact of Victory series, that this was an area that Conservatives needed to do well in to win. And if you look here, they picked up 2 ridings. They weren't actually that close in, St. Catharines. They were nearly 8,000 votes behind, which is a bit of a surprise, but hey, stuff happens, doesn't it? Stuff happens. Moving on to the Kitchener, we'll just call this Kitchener, like, Guelph, just to be clear, because I'm including Guelph in this. Because Kitchener, to a lot of people, mentally includes Cambridge and, like, Waterloo and such. Doesn't necessarily mentally include Guelph, but I'm including Guelph because it's close enough to Kitchener, geographically, and I don't want to call it rural Ontario, and it definitely doesn't fit in the GTA. I mean, comment below if you want to disagree here. Now, this is one of the interesting regions to me, because disproportionately, the Conservatives did really well here in seats. If we go look at the map, the Conservatives picked up 3 seats and were very close to a 4th. Very close to a 4th. But you look at this is actually the worst performing small urban area for the Conservatives. The Liberals gained nearly 12 points, and the Conservatives only barely gained 8. Now, on average, on net, the region did shift to the right, but a lot of the reason why this went relatively well for the Conservatives is this Liberal vote in Kitchener area, it did go up 60,000 at the expense of partially from the NDP and mostly from new voters, but it's actually quite inefficient. You look at some of these ridings in Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, the Liberals are getting well over 30,000 votes, almost 20,000 more than the Conservatives coming in second. Whereas you look at Kitchener, Conestoga, the one that the Conservatives narrowly lost, the Liberals are only leading by 600. You look at places like Kitchener South, the Conservatives only win by about 1,000 votes. Cambridge, only about 1,400 votes. Even another really inefficient area, the Wellington-Halton Hills riding, which is usually more rural considered, the Conservatives only won it by 4,000 votes. So there's like 20,000 vote gain here for the 10,000, vote gain for the Liberals is extremely inefficient. Kitchener Centre is also an extremely efficient riding for the Conservatives. And a lot of people are poo-pooing me when I said this was going Conservative in my election models. And I ended up tweaking some things. I think I forecast that it wasn't going Conservative, but I regret that too. Well, oh well, happens to the best of us. But this is quite remarkable because initially I thought it was going to go Conservative because some Greens are going to vote Liberal again. Now, it turns out the Greens gained votes. It just, the Conservatives gained more voters, which is remarkable. So, this, more than anything, is a prime example of how the Liberal vote share gets worse the higher it gets. Going from 30 to 47 at the same time the Conservatives went from 34 to 42 made the vote share less efficient for the Liberals. They won fewer ridings while having a larger popular vote lead. And that happens in a lot of parts of Canada. The Liberal vote is really efficient in the 30 to 40% range, and it gets really inefficient the higher it goes. The higher it goes, the less efficient it is. Because they start blowing out places like Guelph or Waterloo by nearly 20,000 vote margins. It's incredibly inefficient. Their voters are really concentrated on the macro sense. It's just their voters are also more likely to turn out. So, in lower turnout elections like this one, 2021, they have an edge. But once you start having turnout go up by a meaningful amount, 10% higher turnout in the last election, things change. Now, another interesting one of these small cities is London. Always interesting, but London's a very interesting one. Because again, we see a very big increase in Liberal vote share. They gain just shy of 14 percentage points. And the NDP collapse. They lose almost 17 points. And the Conservatives get a comfortable increase. The region gets slightly more right-wing overall. The Conservatives gain a good amount of votes. Mostly cannibalization of the PPC, it seems, in this particular time. But probably some dippers. And maybe some new voters. But when you actually see the riding changes, it's actually quite interesting. Fanshawe, the NDP had a 10,000 vote lead over the Conservatives in second place in 2021. In 2025, the NDP lost 6,000 votes, and the Conservatives gained 11,000 voters in that region. A lot of it from the PPC. Some of it from new voters, because turnout increases by 7,000. But it is very and the NDP voters seem to mostly be going Liberal. That seems to be the most likely solution to me. Though some might be defecting Conservative, don't get me wrong. But what makes this interesting is you look here in Fanchua, the one riding the Liberals didn't hold, they only gained 6,000 votes. Likely mostly at the expense of the NDP. But you look at West or North Center. Now, West, I think, is a little more forgivable because this was a marginal riding in 2021. So Liberal turnout might have been very high there, and a lot of GOTV might have been focused there because that was a marginal riding in 2021. Only 3,000 vote lead. But you look at these, 10,000 vote gain in West. 11,000 in Center. So they took two ridings they won in London, gained over 10,000 votes and won them again, to the Conservatives who basically gained 0 votes in both ridings. Okay, they gained about 2,000 in Center. But in the one riding where the Conservatives actually gained votes, in Fanchua, they only gain a little bit. And then the Conservatives end up winning that riding, which is quite interesting. And again, a good example of how when the Liberal vote share increases significantly into the 40% range, their vote efficiency decreases. They nearly increased their vote share by 50%, and they could not win the one seat they did not win before. Because they only gained votes. They gained most of their votes in seats they already won. And finally, we have Essex. I'm being a little too long-winded here, but there's some interesting things I want to touch on. Now, Essex is by far the best performing region of all the small cities for the Conservatives. The Conservatives gained 18 points here. The NDP, formerly the first place party in this region, the first place party since 2004, 7 consecutive elections, the NDP got the most votes in Essex. Had their worst performance ever. In this 11 election data set. They got fewer votes in 2025 than they did in 1993. That's crazy. Now, turnout is up a little bit. I suspect this is mostly going Conservative. There is some Liberal, but mostly Conservative. And I think a lot of these dippers did vote Conservative. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them did. And I'll go through why momentarily. You look here. Again, this region, for the longest time, 9 consecutive elections. Safe, very Liberal. Even in the worst election for the left, the worst election for the Liberals in the last 30 years, 60% left wing. This election barely edged out the plurality of the vote here. Now, if we go back, compare region by region, I didn't do this in the last video, but I'm doing this now because it's kind of interesting. You look here, in Windsor West is where the real case study of why I think you saw a lot more dippers vote Conservative this election in this region, like effect. You look here, in 2025, 15,000 voted NDP. 2021, it was 21,000 and a bit. About 7,000 fewer votes, give or take. 6,500 to be clear. The Liberals, 13.7 to about 17. So even if all of those Liberal vote gain is NDPers to Liberals, all of it, no new voters at all, just all NDP to Liberal, that still means over 3,000 of them voted Conservative. And it's very likely, since the turnout went up by just about 6,000, that some of that 3,000-ish votes that the Liberals gained was new voters. It's extremely unlikely they got 0 new voters. So it looks like, I would say, we need more detailed local level analysis from poll-by-poll results. But it looks like a plurality of the 2021 to 2025 NDP defectors went Conservative in Windsor West, and that's why they won the riding. The Conservatives went from a relatively distant third place to a relatively comfortable win. They gained almost 12,000 voters in this riding. Now you look at Essex, for example. Now this is not as clear-cut because it could easily be explained by NDPers going Liberal. So the NDP loses 18,000-ish votes. The Liberals gain just shy of 19,000 votes. So that could be mostly NDPers. But turnout does also increase by 10,000. And the PPC loses nearly over 6,000 votes, who almost certainly go Conservative as well. So it's very possible that these NDPers went mostly Liberal. But I think, especially based off of Windsor West, I think it's probably more split, and a lot of this Liberal gain is new voters. And Windsor-Tecumseh is another good example of this. The Liberals barely win 2021 Windsor-Tecumseh, and they gain 14,000 new votes. Now, the NDP loses 13,000. And it could very well be strategic voting, they barely lost this time. It could be strategic voting that the NDPers went Liberal. That could explain it. That would be almost exactly match to match. But there's also 13,000 new votes. And the Conservatives gained nearly 17,000 voters. So, in my mind, it seems very likely that a substantial portion of these NDPers went Conservative in this riding. Again, I'll know more when we have poll-by-poll results, but that's just kind of the details here. And I realize I'm overdoing this video, but anyways, we'll finish up here. This is my final one point here. This is the small cities except Ottawa. So this is Hamilton, Kitchener, Niagara, Waterloo, London. I don't know why it's Waterloo. Essex. That's those areas, those cities. Why is this broken? Oh. There we go. And we can see here, you look at these cities across all of them, best performance for the right. The most votes the right has ever gotten. Turnout increased by quite a bit. Conservative vote share went up a lot. NDP vote share collapses, the worst performance in 30 years. And that seems to be really a lot of the gist across the country. And we're going to keep seeing this pop up. We'll see this a lot in the next video because I'll probably do like Alberta. Comment below if you'd rather me do Alberta in the prairies or Alberta and BC. I'm not entirely sure if I want to do the prairies because I'm not sure if these are that interesting, but we'll see. I mean, I'll do them if people want to see the video, but let me know. Let me know if you want to make these videos be a lot shorter because I could do Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC as 3 different videos. Let me know. But with that, I bid you guys adieu, and I'll see you next week with something else.